So I did make a little bit of a scale change for the terrain, just setting it to 7 meters. And another thing that I'm going to do is go back into the ecosystem material and edit the density or any of the productions. It's all linked to the same top noise. And where I have that 0.3 set up on the Z, it looks like it's maybe a little too small. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to 0.8 just so that we can see more of the variation, because it looks like it was just because there really isn't a whole lot of variation in the height of the terrain at the moment. It's not all that beneficial. It's actually causing a problem. Maybe I'll bring it up to 1.5. It's just because it is difficult to see exactly where all of the areas are being cut out, and everything was mixing a little bit too much. So this will make it a little bit easier for you to understand exactly what it is that's going on. So what we want to do now is go over to the Material tab where we can see our ecosystem materials. So all the different grass blades we set up. And what we're going to be doing is changing and swapping out some of the textures. So we're going to edit the material, the young grass blade, and go ahead and edit the function and load in our color young small. And we will need to rotate that. And that's pretty much all that needs to be done for that. Maybe we can go into the backlight and make it a little more intense of a yellow. Let's go ahead and take that bump and set it to 0.0. Actually, we'll just set it to maybe 0.3 and see how that turns out. And that's going to be, if you're using version 8 or lower, a depth of 1.5. So this will be a little bit lighter. And we should have a bit of an OpenGL refresh on that. And now we're going to go through some of the other ones and edit and replace with the darker color. So our dark small variation, and maybe set the bump to 0.15, which is going to be for view 8 and lower 0.75. Okay, so this is what it currently looks like. Some of those taller blades of grass I think I'm going to be scaling down, finding out which species those are, kind of manipulating that. I do want to modify the density. Right now I'm basically using just the reverse version of the presence function, but instead I want to use a more minimal amount of it. So going to the density, I'm going to select the map and change the input range to use a smaller portion. So let's go ahead and use 0 and -0.5. Let's see how that turns out. That might be too much. Just trying to get it a little more dense throughout. So increase the overall density to 96. With that change, it looks a lot better. Another thing I want to do is go into the scaling and orientation, and the maximum size variation is currently set to 1 uniform. I'm going to turn off or set this to 50% towards non-uniform, set the maximum size variation on the Z to 1, and then actually we'll go ahead and 1.3 on the Z, and then 0.5 for the other two. And that way we're going to get a lot more up and down variation, but some scales that are closer to the original design. of each of the species. It seems to be working pretty well. I'm going to go back to the density function and increase that value up to 1 for the output range, the lower value, and just fill in some more of those areas. And one of these does need to be reduced. So try AO2. I think that might have been the one. Just a little bit of tweaking here and there, just to get the size the way we want it. But the next thing we're going to do is take that density function, or the presence function, since that was the original function, and bring over that noise to the soil material. And since we can't output from materials a custom dependency, we're going to have to find a way to get it in as easily as possible. I am going to save a version of the scene I'm currently at. A lot of times what you can do is go into the function and we might be able to just copy and paste that entire function. But I don't want to overwrite anything in the soil material, so that's the biggest trick. What I think I'm going to do is grab those 3 nodes, Control C on the keyboard, and see if I can copy them. Go to the soil layer, edit the function, and see if I can paste it in. And I was able to Control V paste. If that doesn't work, and it's really hit or miss, sometimes you can copy and paste, sometimes you can't. What I suggest you do is create a meta node up at the top. Create meta node, save it out just as a temporary file, and load it into your other function, and then you can ungroup it. That works pretty well. So if you haven't done that before, you can create a meta node, save it, and I've got a couple of temps in here. And then once that's saved, you just load it, select the file you saved, and then when that is in the function, you ungroup it, and that way you can get functions back and forth between each other. So what I'm going to do is use this function and first control a color map, and what we're going to do is reverse the color. I think we need to reverse it. Let's go ahead and set this to, I've got a dark brown kind of set up. So RGB values of 28, 24, 20, and then the upper one will change that. We'll keep that at the current value, which is 239, 237, 235, and maybe we'll just bring in that lower one a little more. We might need to reverse it. It is set up so that the dense areas are the lower points of the fractal, so we shouldn't need to modify that. And that should be alright. We're going to add in a blender, combiner node, input 0 to the fractal colors, input 1 to the new color map, and then connect that output from the fractal colors to the blender output, and we're going to multiply. And see how well that works out. So we're going to darken it where the densest areas of the function are. Now we'll probably need to modify that absolute wave filter because it might be a little too intense. I really don't want it to overly darken everything, which it looks like it's kind of doing right now. And I just went ahead and canceled that because it looks like my presence or my density got a little messed up or it's too high. So what I'm going to do is set that lower value to 1.5. And see if we can't thin that out a little bit more. So we'll go back to the soil, edit the function, and let's just check this other setup, and maybe what we can do is reduce the contrast Alright, let's see here. If we go positive with this, is going to reverse. Let's do negative 0.5 for the brightness. So that won't affect as large of an area. Okay, looking at this now, it really looks as if that turbulence I set up is just too small. There's a lot of equal blending throughout, and it just it doesn't quite look right. And that is affecting the way the ground materials or the dirt is being affected. So what I'm going to do is set up that turbulence, and once it looks like it's set up correctly, I'll transfer over the information to the ground material. So I'm going to go into the function for that soil, and that turbulence, I'll go ahead and increase the largest feature to 3, maybe 4, and set the amplitude to 0.3. Maybe change the harmonics a bit to 0.85, and the scaling to 0.3. And see if we can get that over into the soil function. Just replacing the current turbulence. And we'll need to repopulate. Unless you're using dynamic population. That does look a little better now. I think it was just way too noisy. It was removing the majority of the variations and not really grouping them like I wanted. It still looks like maybe there could be a few changes within the density, or, well, the presence from the dense vegetation that was created. But overall, you're starting to get a pretty good idea what you can do with this. The material is now getting darker around the denser areas because it's connected, or at least we duplicated that noise over, and we're multiplying and darkening the dirt to match those areas. So you can adjust that filter that's set up in there and get more of a gradient if you want. And really the idea is to sort of fake the ambient occlusion without having to render it. So it adds a little more variation overall and more realism without actually having to calculate it. Since we do have all the different settings defined, we have some larger patches now in the alpha, so we'll have to go and clean that up a little bit. Maybe increase the transition of the smooth threshold. So here's the finished render of it so far, but definitely changing some more of those settings, and maybe it might even be the noise, or that turbulence node again. Instead of just endlessly adjusting it, there's an easier solution, which is basically to copy and paste the terrain. And don't want to move it. And what I'm going to do is hide the other terrain from the render, and select this one and clear the ecosystem. And I just want to take a look at the material. I could even delete the ecosystem layer. So what I want to do is increase the multiply so we get to see what's going on a bit more. And just take a look at the material and the distribution for the noise. So that looks like that turbulence is up way too high. So what I'm going to do is go into the turbulence and increase the scaling to 0.5, repeat down to, say, 2. Largest feature, let's go ahead and bring it up to 6. Wavelength, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. And bring down the amplitude maybe. Or actually, we'll go ahead and bring up the amplitude to 1 and see how that looks. And we might even just need to reverse the function a little bit, maybe add a little more smoothing. It might be the contrast up too high. We don't want it to be too direct, but we can always end up blending something else with it if needed. I'm going to take the harmonics and bring it up to 2.5, and maybe set this to max or a minimum mode. Let's go ahead and do max, and set the amplitude to 2.5. And then going to that absolute wave, contrast down to 1, brightness at 0. So that's looking better for the material, so we should be able to now just carry over those values to the ecosystem. Of course, to the other object, because we are going to need to delete it. Oh, those lines that are showing are from that max value. So let's try a different combination. And I've decided just to set that combination mode to blend, so it is looking better. But there should be darker areas, or larger dark areas, since it's mostly covered by grass. So just going back to the absolute wave, and modifying the darkness. 1.5, and we'll go ahead and try that, because then we can just reduce the multiply amount, depending on how dark we want it. Okay, so then let's go ahead and grab that turbulence, copy it, and now remember the settings that we just made. Actually, what I can do is just copy the color production and bring it over to the other terrain. And that's going to make it a lot easier. And then go in there, grab that turbulence, copy it, go to the soil ecosystem, and then replace the turbulence with the new one. Populate, and get rid of the other terrain now. Make sure we enable the render, and the density I am going to take a look at, because it doesn't look like it's working quite right, and that's because I have my values set way too out of range. Let's go ahead and set that to 1, and then 0. That's much better. So the density, upper value at 1, lower value, let's do negative 0.1, just maybe negative 0.25, a little more variation. And 0.95 for that lower output. That should be good. And we'll stick with that for now. Okay, so I think I want to modify the scale, controlling it with the function, so that we have a decline in the height of the grass near the areas where there isn't any grass. It also looks like we need more variation on the highlight color and intensity. I think a lot of this kind of goes back, the evenness, to the the A group that was created, where it's all the same material. So maybe I'll go back and edit that so that there are multiple materials, a little more variation, because right now it's a little too even and it's not quite looking right because of it. So just a few more changes. I do want to move on. Obviously not spending all this time just setting this up. There's a couple more techniques I want to show for this grass, and being able to make it look a lot better. So we're going to move on and take a look at some other functions and some other controls that we can do with the different maps. There's some cool stuff I'd like you to see. So I'm going to go ahead and just connect the scaling, or the variable scaling, to the density output, and have a bit better transition there. And then we'll go ahead and move on in the next section.